Going to be looking at a pretty well-known passage this evening and maybe look at it from a little bit different perspective than we normally look at it. We have a beautiful parallel between the child Samuel and the child Jesus. In 1 Samuel, it said that Samuel grew in wisdom, stature, and favor. And it says likewise in Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. And we have these similarities that are very interesting when we think of the development of the two, and that we don't have very much information, and we can figure out a little bit or read a little bit between the lines of what happened with Jesus when he was 12 in Jerusalem. So let's just begin by looking at this account. It's in Luke 2. I have it up here on the screen. Luke 2, starting in verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it. But supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Verse 48, and when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. And he said to them, Why were you looking for me? Do you not know that I must be in my father's house? And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. I like to think that this little tidbit into what Luke says about his mother storing up the things in his heart gives us a little bit of an insight into what Luke says at the beginning of Luke chapter 1 about how he essentially did research. And he went around and interviewed people and spoke to people and looked up, not to negate his inspiration by the Holy Spirit, but he took it upon himself to do a thorough research and reconnaissance, if you will, going around. And I imagine that one of the people that he spoke to was Mary, because she treasured up these things in her heart. And so perhaps that's one of the reasons why this is the only place we find the account of Jesus at the age of 12. Now, typically, when we think of this passage, we think of Jesus' point, which is, you might say, keeping first things first, or keeping the main thing, or Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. All these things will be added to you. And I'm thinking about I heard that someone did a lesson on that with a particular look at the way that he healed people, and that Jesus always kept the main thing about the forgiveness of sins and about preaching that he came to forgive people, not just heal people. And so in this case, we have him being questioned by his parents. They couldn't find him. And so you have this situation where he has to explain to them, well, I'm kind of surprised that you didn't know me well enough by now to know that I'm going to be busy about my Father's work. Much less to talk about or speculate what isn't written about his interactions with those who were the elders and the religious leaders there at the temple. I imagine that would have been fascinating to be a fly on the wall and to just witness that. And so I don't want to look at that, though, not that part of the story. What's interesting about this is that his parents left him. They went ahead and they started home, and he wasn't with them. And there are a lot of people, most people, who will go home without him. There's really only two. I was thinking about, not to get political, just to get real, I was thinking about the way that Marxism has permeated the way that we think. If Christians think in any other groups than lost and saved, then you may have a little bit of Marxism in the way that you think, because it's the idea of dividing and conquering. And the Christian mindset, in its simplistic and pure form, when thinking about the reality of eternity and either being with Christ or not with Christ, there are really only two groups. There are the saved and the lost. And really, there's only one group, from this sense, that Jesus came to save everyone, that God intends for everyone to be part of the one group with him forever. But many people will go without him. In Ecclesiastes 12:7, Solomon says, "Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it." I think I mentioned this recently about the eternal work of God. God eternally upholds our redemption and our purity by the blood of Christ. That's an eternal work. It is not as if it is any effort for him. The work is already finished, but that's something that he eternally does, working with, because we're in his presence. And also those who return to him who are not in Christ, they are eternally acquainted with, if you will, his wrath. And so we return to God who gave us. In John 14:6, of course, Jesus says himself that he's the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. And so there are many, or most, as Jesus says, there are many who go down the broad path without him. And so that challenges us. That challenges us to be introspective, because when we think not only of ourselves, but we think of those who are around us, there are maybe some of us here, and maybe those who are in our lives in our immediate vicinity, who for whatever reason or another have already started their journey home, but they've left Jesus behind. They don't have him. And I want to just draw out a few observations and a few things from this passage that help us think about the different aspects of that. And so the charge really is from this is don't go home without Jesus. Or for us to think of others, when we think of the two groups, the lost and the saved, that we are to think of others and think solely, don't go home without Jesus. Those are my family, those who I work with, that's the way I should think about them. That they are on their way, they're on their journey. And they don't even realize necessarily that they're without him. And so let's look at some different aspects or nuances of this. We're going to just go look at 5 different ones. The first one is this, is that Jesus was left behind by the most unlikely people. Last week, I was driving through a neighborhood, and a lady started screaming at me. I didn't have my window down. I didn't know really what to do, but I rolled the window down. I thought she was kind of upset, kind of mad. And when I rolled my window down, she says, "Have you seen," I don't remember what kind of breed of dog it was because I'm not a dog person, but she said, "Have you seen a certain dog," right? And I was like, I haven't seen a dog. And she looked frantic. I went around the block, finally came back to where she was, and she found her dog. Last year, for the first time, I got to visit Mount Rushmore with my mom. If you've ever been there, you know there's like a trail that you can walk, sort of a circle around, where you can go right up and you can kind of look up their noses and that kind of stuff. And it's kind of neat. But it's kind of a hike. And my mom, it's about a half-mile hike. And it's walking up some steps quite a bit. And so I'm just fascinated with where I am and what I'm doing, right? And there's lots of people coming and going along this wooden walkway that's kind of cut through the woods there. And we come across this lady. She says, "Have you seen a little boy with a dinosaur shirt on?" And I was like, "I haven't seen one." And my mom was like, "Yeah, he came by like 2.5 minutes ago." And my mom was like, I was like, "Well, how did you see this? I don't remember." She's like, "I'm a mom and I'm a teacher. I remember kids and what they're wearing all the time, you know." But this mom was frantic. And it's not who you would think that would lose them. You would think it would be someone that would not be invested in them, or they wouldn't be theirs, or they wouldn't have any much interest in them. And yet we find a lot of times that there are people who leave behind someone, and it's important. It's important. That's why we're always on our trips. We always count off everybody. Even if we think we know, we always get somebody to count and make sure we have everybody. The most unlikely people that we can think of were the ones in the time of Jesus who actually left him. Who, when he came, said, "No, I don't want to have anything to do with you." You look at Matthew 26:35, and you skip down to verse 56. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same thing. But just a handful of verses later, Matthew records that all the disciples left him and fled. That the people who you would least expect the religious people of the day, the Pharisees, they left God behind, and one of the chief of those was Paul. He talks about this, about how he could, if anyone could boast in the flesh, it's him, that he's a Pharisee. And then he says in Acts 22, 3 and 4, he says, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus," and he's speaking to Jews. If you remember, this is when he gives his first account of his conversion there in Jerusalem at the temple, when they're having that controversy over him, and the Romans have come in and really saved his life. And he says, "I'm a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women." And he continues the account there of how he was confronted by Jesus on the road to Damascus. But he is saying that he was of the strictest of what? Of the Jewish religious people. And that the people that he's talking to right at the moment there are the people from the Sanhedrin. They themselves are the people that he was part of. And that he at one point in time had left Jesus. That he had seen, he had seen the gospel. He had heard it from Stephen himself and condoned his death there. And he left the gospel there. And he's saying that all of these here were the same. Those who would be the least that you would expect. And so, when you think about the righteousness of the religious people, can a moral person go home without Jesus? You think about all the good people that you know. Well, just because they're good, or can a very religious person go home without Jesus? You hear people that they make certain claims about certain religious rites that they do or that they've been a part of, or when I was a kid I did this, and yet what? During the time of Jesus, those who would have claimed those certain things, Paul being the chief of those, they went home without Jesus. And what Jesus says is that you got to be more righteous than them. Matthew 5:20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. In Matthew 23:29 following, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we have lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets." And this is one of 7 woes against the Jews there in Jerusalem before he weeps over Jerusalem at the end of the chapter. And he says that you don't realize that even though you check off certain religious rites and you are the religious leaders and you do some good things, at least as far as other people can tell, you would have rejected the prophets just as your fathers did if you lived at the same time as them, in the same way that you rejected me today. And it's not long after that, of course, they are the ones who crucified Jesus. And so along with this idea of the people that we think to be unlikely are the ones who leave Jesus, secondly, Mary and Joseph didn't intend. They intend to leave Jesus. And good intentions, let me tell you, they are more valued in religious organizations than in anywhere else. As I mentioned this morning, Christianity is a volunteer organization. And it's a lot different than a business. In a business, what do you have? You say, okay, well, I'm paying you for this. I need you to follow the policy, and if you don't, I'm going to fire you. In a volunteer organization like the church, what do you have? You have people who are committed, but commitment does not equate to competence, right? And so you have people who are committed and they want to do something good, and then what happens? Then they do something wrong, or they discourage, or they bring shame upon the church, or something like that. But they have good intentions, and there's a lot to be said for good intentions. But what's really important is action. Action that is worthy. Action that is not only intending to be good, but action that is actually good. You find that a lot in culture as well. There are actually some good videos I've seen about that. The idea of feeling good about something or wanting to do good rather than actually doing good. And so Mary and Joseph, they didn't intend to leave him. When you think about all the religious organizations that claim to follow Jesus, Jesus makes the stark statement, you probably already beat me there, Matthew 7:21, that not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. The one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven, that's the one. All these others, they hadn't intended to, but they had. I'm going to look at that passage in its further length later. But Jesus, at one point, he says in Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? And so you have those who claim Jesus. They claim to be his family. They claim to be in the group with him. I think they are. But what happens is something that they didn't really have an intention of happening. James 2:17. James says also, faith by itself, it does not have works, is dead. There are many people, well-intended people, who will, one day, they'll go home without Jesus. And so intentions are not what saves us. It's the reality of our spiritual status. I want to get into that a little bit more in a minute. Number three, after the unintentional leaving of Jesus, you have this fact. It's not Jesus that left them, but they left him. They left Jesus. And the way that we can think of it, I used to even mention this in my prayer a moment ago, that Jesus is our fixed point of reference. That when we think of, and I don't know, I always want to do a lesson on the moral argument for the existence of God. That's really the idea, that the only way that we have a morality is because there's a fixed point of reference of what good is. And good and bad is measured relative to that fixed point of reference. In a moral relativistic postmodern worldview that is prevalent today, you can have absolutely as many genders as you want to. That's the low-hanging fruit of the example of what that is. That when there's not a fixed point of what is actually truth, then really anything can be truth. Well, Jesus himself is the one who is always in the same place. Hebrews 3 and verse 8, the Hebrew writer says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. In 2 John 9, there's not a chapter 1, but just verse 9, I hope you know this verse. Everyone who goes on ahead, and the word there is the word where we get our word progress from. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. And so the idea of progressive in a religious sense, while it can be good in some ways, progressing towards things that are good and spiritually mature, there are many times where progressing is something that happens and you leave Jesus behind, or you leave his teachings or his doctrine behind. In John 15, the whole chapter there, when Jesus is talking to his apostles right before his death, what's really the theme of John 15? He says, abide in me. Without abiding in me, then the Father, there's really not anything that you can do. And so this drawing near to where Jesus is, instead of going off and doing your own thing, rather than like what we find in Galatians 1:6, where he says, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. And of course, the next statement says, and there's not another gospel, which is not another gospel. There's no such thing as another gospel, but you've gone off and followed it. There are people, and I'm thinking of, it can be very daunting for us to speak to people who have been raised in a particular religious persuasion and to discuss with them whether or not they truly know Christ, whether or not they're truly doing what he constructed his apostles to do, to construct them or teach them to observe all the things that I've commanded you. And it can be difficult for us to go up to people who maybe we've known for a long time, and they don't, because they are in a particular religious movement that has moved away from the fixed point of where Jesus is. It's possible to turn away from the gospel. When Jesus sends the messenger and writes by inspiration through, or gives the vision to John in Revelation chapter 2, we have the church at Ephesus being confronted for having done what? They left their first love. That Jesus hadn't gone anywhere. And I would tell you this, that even when you're analyzing the relationships in your life, that if you see that you're drawing apart from someone, ask yourself this question: is it me that's moved, or is it them that's moved? And if I'm the one that has moved, is it because I'm growing in my spiritual maturity? Because there's some times where, and usually the drift happens because either one or the other is drifting away from Jesus himself. We find that over and over again. You've probably discovered that in your life as well. You know, one of the people that I pick on a lot, you might say, is the rich young ruler, because there's so many things that can be drawn out of it. But if you notice one thing about when he walks away sorrowfully, do you see that Jesus then begins to change his tone, and he says something different, and he says, well, now hold on, if you're going to walk away, maybe we can negotiate this thing. No, you don't see that at all. He goes away, and Jesus has said what he's going to say, and if that guy walks away, he must. Jesus cannot be anything other than he is. He cannot compromise who he is. He has to stay where he is. That's where the whole idea of heaven and hell comes from in the first place, or going home without Jesus or not is that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, but that God is always perfect and holy, and in order for everyone to be saved without Jesus, then he would have to diminish himself, and he would no longer be who he is. He would no longer be God. He would no longer be perfect. He would have to compromise who he is and negotiate salvation. But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus didn't try to work it out another way with him. And of course, another guy you might be thinking of is the prodigal son. It wasn't the father who left. It was the son. He left. Which brings us to number 4. After them leaving Jesus, him staying there, number 4, it's easy to lose Jesus in the group. I had it written in a large group. Sometimes it's just in a group. There are many people who have not darkened the doors of a religious institution in a year because they finally have an excuse. Which is sad to say. They finally have an excuse not to. There are people that have been bolstered and have grown in their faith through this diversity. But one of the things that, or adversity, one of the things that adversity does is it actually challenges someone as to whether or not they're in the faith, whether or not they truly are faithful. And there are those who were already on their journey home without Jesus, and a little bit of adversity came into their life in the form of the pandemic this past year. And what's happened is they have not even really noticed. They haven't even really noticed that they're not associating with God's people anymore. And you find Mary and Joseph doing that. But Luke 2:44, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. It's easy to think in all of the busyness of life that Jesus is sort of in the group somewhere. That he, I'm a Christian, and I'm that. And yet what's our schedules full of? Whether it's school or career or entertainment or recreation or being obsessed with politics or something. Whether we're just devoting so much time to our family, a godly thing, and And at the end of the day, we think, you know what, I've done a lot of good things, and yeah, I'm still a Christian, but Jesus wasn't really there because you thought he was in the group. You thought he was there in the mix somewhere, but he's not there. You couldn't see him, but you thought he was there. And that's sort of an interesting thing that we have when kind of going through life and assuming that things are going the way that they should be going and that Jesus is with us. And yet our lives are so full of so many things that after a while, after we made a day's journey like they did, then you find out, no, he's not with me. You know, in Hebrews, this reminded me of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. It also reminds me of Hebrews 2, 1 and 2, which talks about the warning of drifting away, which is this idea that you can very easily be distancing yourself from Jesus, and you don't even realize it. But in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, the Hebrew writer says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, which is what chapter 11 is, he says, let us lay aside every weight. Let us lay aside every weight. And so we can get so busy with life that we have all of these things that are kind of weighing us down or deceiving us in our busyness, that we are busy about all the right things, and yet Jesus just gets lost in the mix, and he's not there. But we think he's there. He says, let us lay aside every weight, the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. I mentioned this, I think it was last week, that goes with this is in Colossians 3, starting in verse 1, that we are to look up or look to heavenly things and not earthly things. To be obsessed or consumed with the things that are eternal. And in that way, we'll have a clarity of whether or not our group is one that Jesus is actually in. Jesus' example, again, what I mentioned earlier, shows us that he always kept first things first. And that sometimes he can get lost in the priorities, but Jesus set the perfect example of never doing that. Which brings us to number 5, and that is that even though it's easy to lose Jesus in the group, number 5, they could have known that they had left Jesus. Isn't that an interesting idea or a thought? They could have known if they had wanted to. They made some assumptions, but they could have known. Jesus leaves us an example, as I mentioned a moment ago, but talking about his example of suffering in 1 Peter 2:21, we're told to follow in his steps. And if they wanted to be clear that he was with them, they could have retraced his steps. They could have followed where he was. Now, eventually they do that once they realize he's not with them. But instead of assuming things at the beginning, they could have made sure. They could have asked cousin so-and-so and sister this and grandpa whoever, and where is he? Oh, he was eating a piece of pizza earlier in a snow cone, and he's around the corner. I don't think they had snow. Maybe he did a miracle and made a snow cone. I don't know. That would have been really neat. But they could have done a little bit of legwork instead of just assuming that it was there. But you think about all of the people who fall prey to not all of what Romans 1 is about, but in Romans 1:20, what does Paul say? He says that at least knowing that God exists is something that is self-evident. His invisible attributes are clearly seen. That there are things that we can know. My mind goes to 1 John 5:13, that we can know that we are saved. We can know that Jesus is with us. We can know that he's in the group, that we're traveling with him, that we're going home, and that he's with us. He says, Jesus himself says in John 12:47 and following, if anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The word that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. Occasionally, I'll get overwhelmed by some things. If you were to just sort of sit and meditate on what eternity is, if you just sit and do that for a while, eventually you'll sort of you'll be approaching a nervous breakdown because smoke will start coming out of your ears, and you won't know how to do that. You won't know how to get that far. And I'll show you, there's a video I watched that talked about different types of infinities if you really want your brain to sizzle a little bit. That some infinities are greater than other infinities, and which kind of infinity is heaven like, right? Makes my brain melt down. And that is that God is not a deistic God. He didn't set the top spinning, set the planet spinning, and just step back. He is a theistic God. He is a God who creates us and then interacts with us and reveals himself and speaks to us. That's what theism is. And in revealing himself to us by inspired writers and prophets, he has expressed his heart to us, his will to us, his intentions for us to be in a relationship with him, and how he's going to accomplish that on our behalf, and how we can be included in with that covenant that he's established. And all we have to do is just pick it up and just read it. When you really ever just ponder what it is that you hold in your hand, that it is absolutely the product of the miraculous, and that it isn't anything like anything else that's ever been written. And then you begin to think about how many people just say, "Nah, I'm not interested. I'm not gonna see. I'm not gonna see I'm not gonna look." Sometimes it's just they're just naive. They don't know what they're doing. Sometimes people are afraid that what they read is going to confront their life in some way. But just the idea that God has gone to all this trouble to reveal himself to us and his intentions and his word, and it's there for us to look at. And Jesus says, look, when I leave here, I didn't come here to condemn you. I came to save the world. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. What's the next verse? For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He says, that's why I came. I came to save you. Now, when I leave, you're going to know what judges you. The words that I've spoken will judge you in the last day. And he says, if you want to know if you're with me or not, I'm going to give you the means by which you can assess your spiritual status and where you are on that eternal journey and whether or not I'm with you. Going back to Matthew 7, go to this passage a lot because it's so to the point. It's on the nose. Matthew 7, starting in verse 21, Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name, do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. And so we have here mentioned, just as at the end of John 12:48, that will be judged in the last day. He's mentioning the last day here in Matthew 7. He says there are going to be a lot of people who are on that journey, and they just kind of assumed that they were with me, and they were kind of religious, and they were well-intentioned. It wasn't the people that you would think would leave me, but he says, you weren't. But you knew how. You knew how to know. Because I spoke words to you, and I told you those words would judge you. I gave my will to you, and I told you to follow it, or that I would tell you to depart when you were surprised at the end of this life that you made your journey home without me. We need to be those who have decided and are diligently searching what God has given us by inspiration to know whether or not Jesus is with us on that journey. We can know by looking to the Bible, and that, I'll tell you, that is what is key about just studying the Bible with someone. That's why it's so important. We're going to look at next week with shepherds is the essentiality of them being able to articulate and defend the truth. If they can't, then how do they even know? How do they know their spiritual status and if Jesus is with them? And the reason it's so important for us to know is that we can help other people to assess their own spiritual status. And it only happens by actually studying and reading and discussing it with others and hashing it out. Sort of like the conversation of the different nuances this morning, hashing those nuances out. In conclusion, I'll just look at one more that drives this point home. In 1 John 2, starting verse 3, John says, "And by this we know that we have come to know him." We know that he's in the group. We know that we're traveling with him. We know that we're going to the same destination he's going if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, "I know him," but does not keep his commandments is a liar. The truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. And so I'll just leave these up here just to recap. The charge here, the challenge of introspection and of helping those around us assess this, is to ask the question, are we going home without Jesus? It's a tragedy if we do. Jesus was left behind by the people that were most unlikely to. They didn't intend to leave him. They left him, he didn't leave them. And it's easy in life to think that he's there when he's not. He's been shuffled to the bottom of the priority stack. But we can know. We can know if he's with us or not. It's not just a flip of the coin. We can have confidence about this. We can have a hope that is based on the facts and not just a hope that's based on, well, I wish, or I hope. There's a lot of people who, when you ask them about their salvation and you ask them about eternity, they answer in that kind of a way. Well, I hope so. I kind of hope that I've been good enough. I hope I've been a good person. I hope that maybe some of the religious rites I've done in my past add up to my salvation in some way. And those types of answers are devoid of any of the knowledge of true salvation. And salvation by grace through faith. Have you come to the grace of God in the blood of Christ? He's poured it out for you. You can know that he's with you. You can travel alongside him. He's there. He's on his way. And you can come alongside him and you can join him. That's the invitation for him to actually make you part of the group, part of the family. And they usually traveled in the extended family groups. That's really what the church is. And you can be a part of that if you're not a Christian. By realizing that he is on a journey home and that there's only one way to the Father, and that's to journey with him. Only by his blood can you enter the presence of the holy God, holy by the holy blood of Christ. If you believe that and you're willing to travel with him, which means following in his steps, submitting to his will, to his purpose, actually being diligent about studying and knowing what is his will exactly. Do I really know that I know him and that I'm in a relationship with him? By actually being united with his work, his death, burial, and resurrection and baptism. If you need to be baptized into Christ, please come to me. We'll study about that. Maybe somebody is watching here online and you've been thinking about that and you want to study about that. Please reach out to me and we'll talk about that. We'll study about that. I'd love to baptize you into Christ and for you to be part of the family that by grace and by the mercy of God we can be a part of, and that we can journey together in faithfulness to him. Maybe you have a prayer need tonight that we can take you in our arms and lift you up, that we can help you in some way in your spiritual fight, in the struggles of life. Maybe you have something that you need to bring to us. You're more than welcome to do that. We'd love for you to open yourselves and make yourselves vulnerable to us. That only enriches our relationship to one another. So if there's anything you need, please come as Randy leads us in this song. Let's stand together.